IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy, where we discuss current and policy issues of importance. I am Priyal, a research analyst working at the Takshashila Institution, and I have with me my colleague Aarthi, who is a program manager. In today's episode, we are talking about whether there is a need for humanitarian intervention to stop mass violence, and if we do, what are the criteria that we are defining, right? So now, before we jump into the conditions and everything else, Aarthi, I wanted to ask you is, when we talk about humanitarian intervention and mass violence, how exactly are we defining those? Is there any definition that we strictly adhere to when we talk about this? Can you tell us about all of this?
Yeah, I think, humanitarian intervention has become such a big issue in the international realm because as history can tell you, there are so many instances where an outside agency intervened, but there have also been plenty of instances where they haven't intervened. So I think in order to build a case for humanitarian intervention, it's really important to define what it is, and only then we can take it forward. So one of the things that I resonate with in terms of what humanitarian intervention is, to me, it is a deliberate incursion into a state by an outside agency to change the functioning, policies, and goals of its government to achieve effects that favor the intervening agency, which basically means that sometimes an external party gets involved when they see it necessary because there's been some changes to the way the government functions. But the important thing here to see is how they intervene to achieve policies that they think is best suited to their needs. But the problem is here, when you do intervene, you need to know what your responsibilities are. It is really important to lay down the fact that they have a responsibility to protect and not the right to intervene, which basically means that interveners have an obligation to the victims and not authority over the perpetrators. And this is a very delicate balance to maintain. And I think, by not respecting this balance is when things start to get a little tricky.
Right. So that's actually like, now that you've defined what exactly it is and what responsibility the intervener has in this, like, do you think there is any sort of like exceptions to these rules where we know that generally like maintaining law and order and everything is a responsibility of a particular of the government of the country, right? And we know that humanitarian intervention happens in exceptional cases and stuff like that. So when we talk about these exceptional cases, like what exactly are these exceptions?
Okay, so to present a case for intervention, I would like to propose something that I call conditions of exceptionalism, where the first case would be there has to be a gruesome or unacknowledged violation of human rights. The second condition would be when victims of mass violence are incapable of handling the situation and desire international aid. And third, the ramifications of withholding intervention will be worse than intervention. So these are the conditions that I think call for intervention.
Right. Now that, like, you've sort of like defined three conditions on which you call upon, you say that is when these human interventions is absolutely necessary. The first condition that you had laid out was there must be severe and unacknowledged violation of human rights, right? So when we talk about like that, has it happened before? Can you give us any examples of the same?
Right. So it's important to remember that states have the right to sovereignty and the international community must respect that. So when you say there has to be a gruesome and unacknowledged violation of human rights, it is important to remember that sovereignty also carries with it a sense of responsibility to recognize its citizens as those having their own existence and are not extensions of the state. So it's important to know that there exists a community of mankind which transcends the individual's sovereign states. So being human cannot be renounced. And so, in practice, not all people actually enjoy their human rights, but they do have a right to human rights, if that makes sense. Like every person is entitled to having human rights. So, and it's when this right isn't being given to them, it's when they cannot access these rights, is when I think intervention is required. And but one thing to remember is that since we talk about how there has to be a gruesome and unacknowledged violation of human rights, and I just want to take a moment to focus on the unacknowledged part of this, because in the case of the Armenian genocide, I don't know if, a lot of people know this, but speaking about the genocide in Turkey is actually punishable by law. And the sad thing is, the denial of the crime constitutes the direct continuation of that very crime. And it's only by recognition and condemnation that you can prevent the repetition of such crimes. And I think one of the biggest harms of mass violence is not even recognizing it. So again, this is why I want to stress upon how there has to be a gruesome and unacknowledged violation of human rights, and only then can an external party intervene.
I'm glad that you spoke about, a gruesome and like unacknowledged violation and the fact that what has happened in the Armenia and stuff. Now, one of the other points that you had mentioned was that the victims must be unable to handle the situation on their own, right? So you also stressed upon that when you were talking about the criteria on which the human intervention is allowed and there is a need for it. So, can you tell us more about this particular part?
Right. So I think before getting into, a situation where victims are incapable of handling the situation, I just want to touch upon what mass violence is. So there is no universally agreed upon definition, but the one that kind of resonates with me is the one that's laid down by the Anti-Terrorism Emergency Assistance Program, which defines an act of mass violence as an intentional violent crime that can result in physical, emotional, or psychological injury to a sufficiently large number of people and significantly increase the burden of victim assistance and compensation for the responding jurisdiction. And the reason I mentioned this one is because of its holistic nature. So it addresses the perceived motive of the perpetrator, the scope of the crime, and the need for assistance. And it presents mass violence as a crime that requires humanitarian intervention. So, and now that we know, like, at least from what I have defined mass violence as, there are instances where some states may seem to have an unfavorable structure that as seen by the international community. So for instance, take the Vietnam War, right? So it was at a time where there was a fight against communism, right? And the United States was determined to rid the world of communism because it did not fit into their notion of an ideal social structure. And the Vietnam War is a perfect example of this, right? So initially, the US intervened to protect the South Vietnamese, but soon their prolonged presence actually did no good, right? So, and in fact, the locals themselves didn't want American troops to be there because if you read a lot of the literature, you'll see that there have been plenty of instances where, the locals have said that the United States troops have only made the situation worse, right? So, this is why it's really important to know that every violation of human rights does not call for intervention, right? So, humanitarian assistance is necessary only once governments or combatants have been willing or unable to shoulder their respective responsibilities. So, to me, even like look at Myanmar, right? So, I think, again, this is just my opinion, but I think it it was a safe bet to let the whole situation play out right before intervening. I mean, of course, there were acts of, crime that were committed. We're not going to deny that. But I think in that moment, it made more sense to let people of the country handle the situation better, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that actually makes sense with what you said, because a lot of times what happens is the external factors definition of, how exactly the country is able to handle the situation may not be your definition, your country's way of handling things. So you need to sort of like wait or sort of not jump into the matter with until probably, and because a lot of times what happens is when you jump in, probably you're making things worse, right? So knowing that is actually very important. But before we move on to the next question, we are going to take a short break here.
Hey everybody, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Storytellers and Storytellers, Vineet talks to filmmaker and production designer Uzair Merchant. He shares how he's created the world's first ever NFT music video. On The Habit Coach, Ashton talks to Joe Town, Hollywood actor and coach of the performer's mindset. They decode various aspects of the high performer mindset and how to deal with mind blanking. On Press Decode, Sara Vagda and Prafulla discuss the controversy around Joe Rogan's Spotify podcast and Netflix India's growing woes. On The Longest Constitution, Priya discusses menstruation, maternity, and disability at the workplace. And on Ikaduka Economy, Abhinav and Dr. Junjunwala discuss the effects of rising inflation. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Also, please do tell a friend. It really does help us when you spread the word about our podcast. And I'd also like to ask you if you could rate or recommend wherever you listen to our podcast. And speaking of where you listen to this show, if you're on an Android phone, do check out our new Android app. We have a brand new app with a brand new listening experience. Definitely check it out. I think you will enjoy it. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Bank of Baroda and CoinSwitch Kuber. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Hello and welcome back to ATP, where Priyal, that's me, and Aarthi, we are discussing about humanitarian intervention and mass violence, and when exactly is intervention okay from other countries. Now, continuing with our previous conversation, so one of the other points also that you had mentioned when talking about the criteria was that you said that the ramifications of withholding intervention should be worse than intervention. And when that happens, this intervention is okay by other countries, right? So can you like deep dive into that further and tell us about if there are any examples that you know of that sort of like explain the situation or this condition better?
Yeah, okay. So for me, I think this is the most tricky condition because I think this is where the double standards as a problem of selectivity comes into play, where, it's either your motives are either characterized as sins of omission or sins of commission, right? So I think sometimes intervention is driven by self interest rather than a genuine humanitarian concern, right? And for instance, you intervene in a country where, where any sort of change to the situation can affect your country in terms of the resources available or in terms of ideology. So more often than not, countries do intervene when it harms their own status, if that makes sense, right? So, but unfortunately, moral principles do not exist in isolation of other principles, and it is challenged by practical realities, right? And so it's really important to see, when to intervene. And unfortunately, there have been cases in the past where the ramifications of withholding intervention was worse than intervening. So take instance the Rwandan genocide, right? The US didn't intervene, and in fact, Bill Clinton did actually come out and apologize for not intervening, right? And the thing is, they didn't even acknowledge that it was a genocide. The word genocide was just said like in secrecy, and they knew instantly that if they do acknowledge the severity of the situation, they will have to get involved, right? So, and I think here the US was sort of acting on self interest because they had a reputation to protect. And I think not intervening seemed to suit their own best interest. And it can also be justified that because it was a problem between two clans, the Hutus and the Tutsis, it didn't make sense for outside parties to get involved. But we know how it ended up, right? Like we know the extent to which it affected people. So to me, this is the trickiest condition. And I think, I mean, of course, it's so hard to come up with a solution, right? Like there is no statement or like situation where you can say, yes, this is what needs to be done, because it depends on scenario to scenario, right? But I think if you do intervene, just think of the ramifications of not intervening as opposed to intervening.
Right. That actually is quite interesting. And like, I like the fact that you explained why it is exactly very tricky. Now you've explained what exactly the different exceptions for, need for intervention is, and, you've given examples of the same. Now, another question I wanted to ask you, Aarthi, is when we talk about, like, we say that okay, intervention should be done in these kind of situations, and these are like the extremes when humanitarian intervention is absolutely necessary, and these are the conditions that we need to keep in mind, and all of that, right? And everything's fair, but all of this is extremely theoretical. And when we talk about, like, so now when we're saying that okay, this needs to be done, one of the main question I think we need to tackle or we need to ask is, to what extent do you think intervention is possible? Or like, if I were to like ask it in another way, now, so how much should the international community be involved? And what is their responsibility post intervention? So could you tell us more about that?
Right. So I think, again, even this is so hard to say, right? Because it does depend on each situation on its own. But I think when you do it, the decisions before intervention should depend on the decisions after intervention, which basically means that think of the consequences of your actions, right? So think about how you can rebuild the society. And of course, like you do, intervention happens out of genuine concern, but it also becomes the responsibility of the interveners to not only ensure minimum casualty, but also enable a better structure post atrocity, right? So I know we talk about like, we're going to talk about the responsibilities post intervention. I personally think for a successful intervention to take place, they must dismantle the existing regime and help establish a self determined one, right? But since a post genocidal society or a society where mass violence had just occurred, it is vulnerable. And I think international interveners should not promote complete democracy. And I'll tell you why, right? Because it those who intervene to stop genocide should take seriously the possibility of limiting democracy. And I think you need to promote a hybrid political institution, right? And this combines the popularly elected bodies with customary authority structures. And this is really important because since society is super vulnerable, there are chances of, if you promote complete democracy, there are chances of an uprising again, right? Because everyone's going to have a voice. Everyone believes in, everyone will like to follow what they believe in, right? So I think when you rebuild the society, you need to be extremely careful in the kind of society that you're building, right? So, and one of the most significant aspects of humanitarian intervention is the civilian component, right? So in a post genocidal society, you need to impose institutional therapy, and wherein the perpetrators need to be punished, and the victims need to be provided with an atmosphere of peaceful self-determination, right? So the goal is to train the citizens of that country to be proactive in good governance to prevent a similar situation happening again, right? Which is why I think complete democracy might be a little too much for citizens to handle, right? And but also, I mean, but whatever the interveners decide, make sure you do something, right? Like, so take for instance in Afghanistan, they, I mean, it was occupied by interveners for years, right? And as soon as they left, it started to collapse, right? And this is not allowed. This isn't acceptable because as long as they were there, of course, like, there was some sort of safety. But once they leave, once the interveners leave, you need to think about what's going to happen after that, right? You need to help build a society that protects its citizens. And yes, in theory, it is very easy to say, but which is why I think just defining each concept, defining the conditions to intervene, and also defining what comes after intervention is extremely important. And you cannot keep comparing one use case or one situation to another because everything needs to be looked at individually. But I mean, learn from your mistakes, of course, but I mean, like, don't like restrict yourself to what happened in a particular country, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that actually makes sense. And also, like, the fact that once the intervener leaves, having stability of your country, like despite after the intervener leaves, is very important, because if the structure collapses, then what was the point of the whole intervention anyway? Like, there was a momentary peace, obviously, but after that, when everything comes crumbling down and you need to, there's chaos everywhere, then again, it's downfall of the country, right? So yeah, thank you so much for going through, for answering all these questions, Aarthi, and for actually explaining what exactly we mean when we talk about humanitarian intervention, and what are the conditions when we need to do so, and what are the steps that we need to follow after intervention. So this was a very interesting and very insightful conversation. Thank you for joining.
Thanks, Priyal.
To our listeners, thank you for listening to this episode, and please listen to more episodes of All Things Policy. This is Priyal signing off. Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Namaste, this is Cyrus Brocha. I am part of the government cancel culture program to remove rubbish off all the different streams available. So what we have is all the collected rubbish we put together on our show. It's called Cyrus Says. It's on IVM Podcast. You have to watch it and listen to it. It's on our app. It's on our website. It's on the YouTube channel. It's on Facebook. There are many different ways. Don't bother me and ask me how. You have to find out. We talk to different personalities. Many of them are known. Some are just people we meet downstairs and invite them up for chai. But the point is, it's fun and it's very therapeutic. So please join in and listen to Cyrus Says.
Remember the days when our granny used to narrate once upon a time stories? Let's bring back the good old days of moral stories with Storytime Tamil. Hi, I am Ravishankar Balachandran, host of Storytime Tamil podcast. I would like you to entertain and educate your children with stories from Storytime Tamil. Tune in to the new episode sharp at 7 p.m. every day on IVM website, IVM podcast app, YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcast from.